I first got the word a week or so before Thanksgiving that Uncle Ralph's wife was in the hospital in Searcy. She had just undergone emergency bypass surgery. A tiny woman, Ginger, had been in poor health for some time due to obstructive pulmonary disease and allergies. Nobody in the family seemed to know that she had heart problems as well.
Sorry, let's take that back, that line again. I'm having trouble on this mic getting back there. I don't know where it is. Take that one.
Nobody in the family seemed to know that she had heart problems as well. That's country folks for you. Don't tell anybody anything other than the bare minimum. Don't want folks to worry, or worse, feel sorry for you. She seemed to be doing better after the surgery, but that didn't last long. And after a couple of days, the word from the hospital said she had taken a turn for the worse. I got up there early the morning after getting this news. After I entered the hospital, I looked through the glass in the door of the family room where Uncle Ralph had spent the last 2 nights. Ralph was alone in the room. He was sitting in a recliner staring at nothing in particular. I went ahead and let myself in. "Boy, am I glad to see you," he said as he stood up to me. "I was afraid I was going to have to do this by myself." I thought I'd do polite. "What's going on?" I asked. "I talked to the doctor this morning," he said. "They say her lungs are filling up with fluid. They can drain her off, but it won't do no good. They'll just keep filling up. And now her kidneys aren't working. They can keep her alive for who knows how long, but she ain't never going to get better." "Well, what do you want to do?" I asked. It was mainly a rhetorical question. I knew the answer. He sat back down in the recliner. "Ginger and I talked about this last week. She told me that she didn't want to be hooked up to no machine if she wasn't going to get better. The doctors told me it ain't no use." I just let him talk. "My Uncle Ralph is not a complicated guy. He once evicted the man that was renting the old home place with 357 on Christmas Eve. Overly given to nuanced planning, Ralph Bivens is not. But this was the biggest decision he was ever going to make in his life, and so he needed to work it all out in his head as best he could. The poor man, being exhausted as he was, must have repeated the substance of their conversation at least 3 times over the ensuing 45 minutes. Each time the story began with, 'Ginger and I talked about it last week.' And each time I acted as if I were hearing it for the first time. 'Let's go tell the nurses,' he finally said. We went back through the big double doors to the ICU where Ginger was lying. Her eyes were fixed at a point somewhere in the heavens. She was struggling to breathe, her tiny chest heaving up and down. Dear God in heaven, it was time. 'I want this to end,' Ralph told the ICU nurse who was standing by the machine that was keeping Ginger tethered to this shore. 'Ginger wouldn't want this.' 'I understand,' the nurse whispered as she squeezed Ralph's arm. 'We have to get permission from the doctor to begin the procedure, and he has to be in the room to order us to turn the machine off. I'll call you once I make the arrangements.' We returned to the relative sanctuary of the family room to await the call. Ralph collapsed into the recliner. He put his head in his hands. I knelt before him. 'You're doing the right thing,' I said. 'Even if by some miracle she survived, she would be bedfast in a nursing home somewhere on dialysis. Her lungs have to be damaged now worse than they were. God knows if her heart would get better. You're doing the right thing.' He shook his head back and forth in his hand. 'No, God knows she wouldn't want that. I promised I wouldn't let that happen. I promised her.' After a few minutes, the phone on the wall rang. Ralph took the call. It was the nurse. It was time. Uncle Ralph hung up the phone. He straightened his shoulders and pulled himself erect. He smoothed his silver hair back. He inserted a plug of Taylor's Pride tobacco into his jaw. I opened the door. 'You ready?' I asked. He nodded. Then together we processed down the long hall to the ICU. He paused when we got to the big double doors. He turned to me. 'You got any advice?' he asked. 'Me?' 'Breathe deep through your nose,' I said. 'Hold it. Exhale. Do it twice.' I was training with a boxer back in those days. That's what he always had me do before we sparred. It was the only thing I could think of. He did it twice. He nodded. I put my hand on his shoulder and I hit the button with my fist. And we stumbled through the big doors together. I stayed in the doorway as Ralph said goodbye to his wife. The nurse began shutting down the machine. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It belonged to a man who introduced himself as the chaplain of the hospital. I introduced myself as the nephew from Little Rock. Bless her heart, he whispered. Bless her heart. I know, this is pitiful, I whispered back. Do they have any children that I need to call? No children. Ralph and Ginger married late in life, as they say. The irony of such words coming from my old and single mouth eluded me at that particular moment. How did they meet? I'm sorry? How did they meet? I'm a pastor. I'm always interested in stories about people. You really want to know? Sure, if you don't mind telling me. Not at all, I said. Get this. They first met when Ralph went out there to Ginger's place to do a bush hog job on her pasture. The chaplain's face lit up in delight. He dug his hands into his pockets and rocked back and forth on his heels. I'll be, what a wonderful story, he said. Yeah, it gets better. She invited me back to the house that night for a chili supper. The rest is history. I'll be, he said, still unable to suppress the grin on his face, despite the sadness of the scene in the room before us. We stood there in silence for a few minutes. After a while, the chaplain leaned over to me. Guess he did a pretty good bush hog job on that pasture, huh? I guess so, I said, replied, shrugging my shoulders. After a while, Ginger struggled no more. Uncle Ralph held her hand as she passed away. The doctor was kind. He assured Ralph that he'd done the right thing and that Ginger hadn't suffered. He offered his condolences and turned to leave the room. Excuse me, doctor, Ralph said. Yes, sir, the doctor replied. Would it be all right if I just sat here a little while longer? Once she leaves this room, there won't be nothing left but the pictures. The doctor looked at me. I nodded. Of course you can, he said softly. Of course you can. You can stay until the nurse tells you when it's time to leave. And so Uncle Ralph sat there until they brought in the papers to sign, allowing the hospital to give the body to the funeral home. And then it was time to leave. My Uncle Ralph had kept his promise. I will remember that day and be forever grateful. Because with my own eyes, I saw steadfast love in action. I bore witness to humane bravery, and I was in the presence of the sacred. All these things around Thanksgiving Day a couple of years ago.